The key to this system is that it can only work for very short bouts, like 10, 15 seconds worth of all-out effort. So we think of this as sprint training, high-intensity interval training, and if you're doing low rep, high load strength training, like 1 rep max on the squat. That is the dominant energy system in that situation. Welcome back to the Smart Strength Training Podcast. So I'm looking forward to this one. It's podcast episode 52. And today I'm talking about making the most of your cardiovascular training. Now, the reason I wanted to do this podcast episode was because of a conversation I had with a friend recently. We'll call him Matt because his name actually is Matt. So I chatted to Matt about his training quite a bit, and he was just asking me about like a cycle event he had going on. He wanted to start ramping up his cardio for it. And I just said, look, get onto ChatGPT, tell it what you need to know, and it will spurt out an answer. And then he quite rightly pointed out that ChatGPT was going to take my job, which is obviously very cutting. But then he asked me a question around Zone 2 training that ChatGPT couldn't answer, which was, why are you doing Zone 2 training? Like, it's easy. So kind of what's the point? If you're trying to get fitter, why would you do easy training? And it got me thinking that actually cardiovascular training as a whole is really poorly understood. I think I did a course years ago with a guy called Joel Jameson, and the course was called 8 Weeks Out. I remember thinking at the time, like, this should be like a essential thing that every personal trainer has to learn, because without it, it really is like a missing piece of any coach's understanding of what cardio really is. And I guess because more annoyingly, there's so much the misconception, I guess, around cardio, which is obviously the main one is it's just about burning calories. It's just really about like the fat burning zone or burning energy. And I won't go into that because obviously I've touched on that on podcast episodes before. And of course, we're using energy when we do cardio, but rather than thinking of just like burning energy, let's think of it of what specific energy system are we tapping into. We know we consume carbohydrates and we consume fats in our diet, but we can use different fuels, different substrates at different intensities. And that really is key. You might have heard the expression metabolic flexibility. And that effectively means the efficiency in which your body can switch between using carbohydrates as a fuel source or using fat as a fuel source. And of course, the more you train at different intensities, the better your body gets at being able to convert energy and create this idea of flexibility in our metabolism. So rather than thinking of cardio, I would rewire your brain, sort of like forget that word and think of it more as training energy systems. Energy systems training is what we are doing. But people have heard of this as like the fat burning zone, of course. I'm either using fat as a fuel source or I'm using carbohydrates as a fuel source. Like it's some sort of internal switch where you go from one to the other. But it should make sense that if I'm going for, let's say I've gone to the running track and I'm doing sprint runs, like sprints on the track. Well, my legs, they're obviously pushing really hard, they're propelling me through this powerful workout. But the muscles in my upper back, they're just holding my spine in an upright position. So they're not using, or their energy demands aren't as high as the muscles in my legs. So we're using these energy systems, we're using different energy systems all the time. It's what's the more predominantly used, what becomes the more dominant energy system. And that's the way I would kind of think of this. We're not just using one, we're using a combination of them all, but what's the dominant system based on the intensity of the workout. And that's really what I want to kind of like drive home on this podcast episode. So I'm going to kind of do this in reverse, because normally when you think of, if anyone talks about cardiovascular training, they'll talk about a pyramid and you want to get a really big base at the bottom, then work up. I'm actually going to start at the top and then come down. And I'm going to talk about the phosphagen system. So I touched this a little bit on previous episodes before, but I have to probably repeat myself a little bit here. So we don't actually use carbohydrates and fat as a fuel source. We convert them into usable energy, which is ATP. And your cells, to contract, they take ATP, they break, so ATP is adenosine triphosphate, so 3 phosphate groups. But a cell just needs one of those phosphate groups to fuel a contraction, which leaves ADP. So it's the ability, to use ATP for energy, but also to regenerate ADP into ATP, which drives this system. And this is where we can store phosphocreatine in the muscle, which can donate a phosphate group to convert ADP to ATP. And that's why creatine supplementation is a hot topic, and I've discussed that on a previous episode. The key to this system is that it can only work for very short bouts, like 10, 15 seconds worth of all-out effort. So we think of this as sprint training, high-intensity interval training, and if you're doing low-rep, high-load strength training, like 1 rep max on the squat. That is the dominant energy system in that situation. Then we move down to the energy systems that we're probably a bit more familiar with. So we're thinking of using carbohydrates as a fuel source, and we're thinking of using fat as a fuel source. So when we're using carbohydrates as a fuel source, this is the glycolytic system. And the dominant part of this system is it's anaerobic. So it's used without oxygen, or it's working without oxygen. And then this lasts for longer intensities or longer efforts. It's still at quite high intensity. Your body starts to rely on glucose and glycogen to make ATP without oxygen. It's fast, but it is still limited. So this system dominates for roughly 20 seconds or up to kind of a couple of minutes of hard work. And the probably most known part of this energy system is we produce lactate. And this is where another misunderstanding occurs. People often think of lactic acid as a thing that causes that burning sensation in muscles, but it's important actually to state, or just to know, that lactic acid doesn't actually accumulate in the body. It dissociates into lactate and hydrogen ions, and it's those hydrogen ions that cause acidosis in the blood, and that's that kind of like familiar burning sensation. So it's not the lactic acid, it's those hydrogen ions that create acidosis. Another actual misunderstanding around lactate, which is really irritating, is when people will call it a waste product, which is definitely not. It's a really valuable fuel source that can be shuttled between muscle fibers. It can be used by the heart, by the brain, or it can be sent to the liver and be converted back into glucose to again be used in that cycle. So think of lactate not as fatigue. Think of it as a really important marker for high energy turnover and for metabolic flexibility. So then beneath the glycolytic system is the oxidative sort of fat burning system. But before we go there, let's actually talk about the oxidative carbohydrate metabolism. So we can actually, there is an aerobic glycolytic system where you can use oxygen with carbohydrates as a fuel source. It's not such a system you train in isolation. It's more transition point between, say, zone 2 training, sort of where we're using more carbohydrate, where we're using more fat as a fuel source. So it's like a metabolic crossover point where carbohydrate oxidation meets the dominant fat oxidation, even though oxygen is still used efficiently. So it's that kind of crossover point between the two. And then we move to the oxidative system, the aerobic system that we've all heard about. It's that fat oxidation, or quote unquote fat burning zone. And this is the dominant zone most of the time. Sat here talking to you right now, this is the main fuel source that my body is using. And it's great for long duration, low intensity. This system has plentiful fat on the body, and it's the dominant fuel source for low intensities. But it's slow, of course, in ATP production, but that doesn't matter because it's very sustainable. And again, I'm not working very hard, so I don't need to have a high energy demand. And training here, particularly in consistent zone 2 work, improves mitochondrial density and efficiency, which allows you to generate more energy effectively across different intensities. It's often stated you want to kind of work on the base of that pyramid to make the base as big as possible, because the bigger the base, the higher you can make the pyramid. It's a really nice way to think about it. So let's talk a little bit then about these intensities. And now we'll start at the bottom and work up. And this is probably the most important part of the podcast overall. So low intensity, sort of like sat here not doing anything really, just talking to you. Or when we think about training intensities, we're moving up to that zone 2. So this is fat oxidation. It's when intensities are moderate but not too high. Because if intensity starts to creep up, we start to shift into that glycolytic system, because carbohydrate oxidation is needed to provide enough ATP to actually match the intensity that you're working out at. So this is why pushing zone 2 completely defeats the purpose, which is the conversation I had with my mate. In the end, you move out of that fat oxidation range and you move up into the glycolytic energy system. So it's really important to understand the energy system so you understand to match the intensity to train in the sort of the thing you're looking to adapt overall. Then we move up more to the moderate to high intensity energy systems. That's like glycolytic energy system. That's carbohydrate utilization. So it increases, or carbohydrate utilization increases as that oxygen demand starts to outpace supply. And again, as I said, this is that glycolytic energy system, which we know of as like the lactate clearance and that buffering capacity in that system overall. But again, really important for that metabolic flexibility, teaching the body how to tap into using carbohydrates as a fuel source. And of course, we know that we can teach it to tap into using fat as a fuel source. And then we move to the very top of that pyramid, and that's your high intensity intervals. That's your sprint interval training, which, let's face it, for the last sort of like 10, 15 years has really dominated in, well, probably less so in the last few years because Zone 2 has been getting a little bit more press, but it's certainly been a really dominant form of training overall. One of the things I want to state around this, so we know that high intensity intervals and sprint interval training, we are talking about short duration, sort of like under 20 seconds of all out effort. Because if you start pushing those sessions longer, like 30-second bout, 40-second bout, 50-second bout, you're not in that high intensity interval. You're not in that ATP CPR system. You're starting to come down or starting to use a higher percentage of the glycolytic energy system. I've had lots of conversations, arguments with coaches over the years around, well, no, high intensity interval, it's all about your heart rate. And that's not correct. It's not about your heart rate. Heart rate is a useful metric, but it's not a direct measure of intensity. Really, the perceived effort, so you're rating a perceived exertion, going 10 out of 10 all effort, all out, and ultimately the duration of the bout is going to kind of tell you what energy system you're using. If you've ever noticed heart rate, you do a really hard bout of training and then you look at your heart rate monitor and your heart rate actually starts to, or continues to creep up for 10, 15, 20 seconds after you've actually finished the bout of work, because there's a delay in getting that information to you. And you'll notice as well, like if you do repeated bouts of high intensity intervals, the first bout can be really hard, but your heart rate won't be that high. But as you struggle to recover from one bout to the next, you'll notice the heart rate gets up and up and up and up, and it kind of hits a kind of a natural high point. But also stress, caffeine, sleep will all affect your heart rate. So useful metric, but not the best metric when it comes to doing high intensity intervals. Okay, so let's talk about mitochondria and mitochondrial function, because I think this is one of the most important things that we understand when it comes to why we're training. We're training in these energy systems to use different energy substrates, but ultimately it really is the mitochondria that are converting energy to usable energy. So when we talk about improving aerobic fitness or metabolic flexibility, what we're really talking about is improving mitochondrial function and the ability of your cells to produce energy efficiently. Think of mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell, but more accurately, they're the site of aerobic metabolism. They take byproducts from carbohydrate and fat breakdown, and they use oxygen to generate ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. And the more mitochondria you have, the better they function and the greater your capacity to produce energy aerobically. So how do we improve mitochondrial function, or how do we improve mitochondria as a whole? Obviously we train, but really steady state aerobic training, particularly zone 2 training, because it places a very consistent energy demand on the muscle without overwhelming it or fatiguing it or creating too much acidity, which stimulates that signal to the body to adapt, which increases the mitochondrial density, which basically means more mitochondria per unit of muscle fiber. It increases the oxidative system, it enhances the oxidative enzyme activity, which basically means that you're going to have improved ATP production. And what's really cool about this is that you start to expand capillary networks, improves oxygen delivery to the muscle overall, and improves the ability to oxidize fat and spare glycogen. So over time, this builds a system that's not only more efficient at lower intensities, but also more resilient at higher intensities as well. And this is why we need to think about understanding the intensity we're intending to work at, because that then shows us or tells us what of those substrates we could be using. So intensity is really going to be a measure of the demand of the session, rather than it just being heart rate. As I mentioned, that very much is a proxy overall. And if you're trying to train at a particular intensity, so we're trying to do zone 2, you know you don't want to push those sessions too hard. In zone 2 training, we can use heart rate as a measure, but we know if we start to push them too hard, we start to creep into that zone 3. If we start to do high intensity work, but those high intensity bouts actually end up being more like 30 seconds to a minute, we're actually tipping more into the glycolytic energy system. So when you're doing high intensity work, you want to keep your durations to 20 seconds. If you're doing zone 2 work, yes, in that situation, you do want to have probably a heart rate monitor on, maybe 65 to 75% of your theoretical heart rate max, and it should feel fairly comfortable. You should be able to hold a conversation. And the idea of zone 2 training is going to be that over time, let's use either speed on the treadmill or wattage on a bike, you should be able to maintain a 65 to 75% heart rate. But actually over time, over the course of 6 months to a year, you're jogging faster or you're cycling slightly harder. So now you're being more efficient at, your body is still working the same amount effectively at 65 to 75% of your theoretical heart rate max. But actually, if you look at the dial of intensity on the piece of equipment, you are actually working at a higher output. So you're becoming more efficient overall. And then when we start to move into forms of training that train the glycolytic energy system, we can see in there we're in that kind of 3 minutes, sort of 30 seconds to 3 minute zone. And then we're thinking about doing training that actually starts to produce or increase the acidosis in the blood. We can start to work on things like lactate clearance. So you do bouts of training where the blood acidosis starts to increase, and then you back off and let the levels sort of come back down, and you come back at it again. So you can train lactate clearance, you can train high intensity, you can train at zone 2. So there's all these types of training intensities that you can work on, and you can do that across any kind of modality really. You can do it on a bike, you can do it on a treadmill. Some of these work really well in a circuit format using like kettlebell swings and that kind of thing. Certainly if you're doing more of the moderate intensity around the 3 minute mark, probably those sorts of sessions don't work so well at high intensity, because if you're doing a kettlebell swing, you're not really going to do high intensity 10-15 seconds of kettlebell swings. You are going to be more in that glycolytic energy system. So those kind of circuit-based sessions often really land in that glycolytic energy system. And what I would say as a whole, I think a lot of people's cardiovascular training land in the glycolytic energy system. So to sort of like support that and to have better mitochondrial function and better efficiency across your energy systems is to do some true high intensity intervals, but also do some zone 2 training as well. And then really some practical takeaways are, as I sort of mentioned, don't turn every cardio session into a glycolytic one. Keep your zone 2 sessions truly aerobic at a conversational pace. If you're going to do intervals, make sure that you think about what you're trying to do. Are you trying to do that lactate clearance? And if you're going to do high intensities, make sure you're doing them for a short duration so you don't start to fall down into that glycolytic energy system. And if you can train in a week, if you have the luxury of being able to do multiple cardiovascular training, you can tap into different energy systems. You can look at your workout and say, look, I get a decent amount of this form of training. Like I do a lot of resistance training. I do a lot of like circuits. So I know I get a lot of glycolytic. So to support that, then I need to do supplementary zone 2 training, or maybe I actually want to do true high intensity intervals. And I think that really is the key point of why I wanted to do this podcast. So hopefully that's useful. The idea here really was to sort of like step away from the mindset of just doing cardio and having to push sessions really hard, to really break it into those 3 things. Are you doing zone 2? Are you doing aerobic training? Is it more glycolytic? Or are you doing high intensity intervals? And then don't muddy the water when it comes to ending up having everything being in the same intensity. Like teaching the body to switch between these energy systems at its core, that's what energy systems training, cardiovascular training is all about.